Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight we'll explore a case that shook a small Illinois community in 2009. The Coleman family murders. This is a story of betrayal, deception, and ultimately unspeakable tragedy. As always, we'll tell this story in a gentle, measured pace. Perfect for those quiet nighttime hours when your mind needs something to focus on, as you drift off to sleep. In the spring of 2009, the small city of Columbia, Illinois, seemed like the perfect place to raise a family. Located in southwestern Illinois, just across the Mississippi River from St. Louis. Columbia was one of those communities where neighbors knew each other. Children played safely in their yards, and violent crime was virtually unheard of. At 6 Robert Drive in an upscale subdivision lived what appeared to be the perfect American family. Christopher Coleman, 32 years old, was a former Marine who had served his country with honor. After his military service, Chris had found a prestigious position as the chief of security for Joyce Meyer Ministries, one of the largest Christian organizations in the world. Joyce Meyer herself was a renowned television evangelist whose programs reached millions of viewers globally. Chris's position was no small responsibility. He was trusted with protecting not just Joyce Meyer, but her entire organization from potential threats. He had security clearance, carried a weapon, and traveled extensively with the ministry. It was a job that commanded respect and provided a comfortable living for his family. His wife, Sherry Coleman, was 31 years old, and the embodiment of grace and kindness. Those who knew her described Sherry as a devoted mother and loving wife who had given up her own career aspirations to focus on raising their 2 sons. She was active in their church community and had a warm smile for everyone she met. The Coleman boys were the light of their parents' lives. 11-year-old Garrett was the older of the 2, a bright child who loved sports and was doing well in school. His younger brother, 9-year-old Gavin, was equally energetic and full of life. The boys were inseparable, best friends as well as brothers. From the outside, the Colemans seemed blessed. They lived in a beautiful home, had stable income, were active in their faith community, and appeared to genuinely love one another. Chris would often post on social media about how grateful he was for his amazing family. Sherry would share photos of family outings and the boys' accomplishments. But as we know all too well in true crime, appearances can be deceiving. Behind the carefully curated image of domestic bliss, cracks were beginning to form in the Coleman family foundation. The first indication that something might be amiss in the Coleman household came in November 2008, 6 months before the tragic events of May 2009. Joyce Meyer Ministries received a disturbing piece of mail. It was a threatening letter, crude and menacing, warning that if Chris Coleman didn't quit his job, harm would come to his family. The letter was taken seriously, given the high-profile nature of Joyce Meyer's ministry and the fact that religious leaders sometimes attracted unstable individuals. Threatening correspondence wasn't entirely unexpected. However, this particular letter was different because it specifically targeted Chris and his family by name. Security protocols were immediately put into place. The local police were notified and additional precautions were taken to protect the Coleman family. Chris, being the security chief himself, was naturally concerned about these threats and took them very seriously. Over the following months, more threatening messages arrived. These weren't just letters anymore, they included emails and other forms of communication. Each message was more disturbing than the last, with increasingly specific threats against Sherry and the boys. The anonymous sender seemed to know intimate details about the family's daily routines, their schedules, even their personal habits. Chris reported each threat to the authorities and to his supervisors at Joyce Meyer Ministries. He expressed genuine fear for his family's safety. The stress of these ongoing threats seemed to be taking its toll on the entire household. Sherry became more cautious about her daily activities, and the boys were given additional safety instructions. During this same period, however, there were other changes happening in Chris Coleman's life that weren't immediately apparent to those around him. Changes that would later prove to be crucial to understanding the tragic events that were to follow. Chris's job with Joyce Meyer Ministries required extensive travel. He would accompany Joyce Meyer to conferences, events, and speaking engagements across the country. It was during one of these business trips in November 2008 that Chris reconnected with someone from his past. Her name was Tara Lintz, and she was a cocktail waitress working in Florida. More significantly, she was also an old high school friend of Sherry Coleman. The two women had known each other years earlier, back when life was simpler and the future seemed full of endless possibilities. When Chris first encountered Tara at a hotel bar during one of his business trips, it might have seemed like an innocent reunion between old acquaintances. Tara recognized Chris as Sherry's husband, and they struck up a conversation about old times and mutual friends. But what began as casual conversation quickly evolved into something much more complicated. Chris was apparently captivated by Tara in a way that he hadn't felt in years. She was vivacious, fun-loving, and represented a kind of freedom that seemed increasingly absent from his structured life at home. The affair began almost immediately. Within days of that first meeting, Chris and Tara were exchanging phone calls, text messages, and emails. What started as friendly conversation quickly turned intimate, then passionate, then all-consuming. Chris began arranging his business travel to coincide with opportunities to see Tara. He would fly her to meet him in various cities where he was working with Joyce Meyer Ministries. They would spend stolen hours together in hotel rooms, living in a fantasy world where the responsibilities and complications of real life didn't exist. The relationship quickly became serious. Within weeks, Chris and Tara were exchanging promise rings and talking about marriage. They made plans for their future together, discussing where they would live and how they would build a life as husband and wife. But there was one enormous obstacle to their dreams. Chris was already married, and not just married to anyone. He was married to Tara's former friend, Sherry. This created a complex web of deception that Chris had to carefully navigate. He couldn't simply ask Sherry for a divorce, and the reason had to do with his job at Joyce Meyer Ministries. Joyce Meyer Ministries, like many religious organizations, had strict moral codes for its employees, particularly those in leadership positions. Divorce was strongly discouraged and could result in demotion or termination. For someone in Chris's position as security chief, maintaining a spotless reputation was essential. Chris found himself trapped between his growing passion for Tara and the practical realities of his career and financial obligations. He had a prestigious job that paid well, providing for his family's comfortable lifestyle, but he also had dreams of a new life with Tara, dreams that seemed impossible to achieve without destroying everything he had built. As the weeks passed, the pressure on Chris intensified. Tara was growing impatient with the secrecy and wanted him to make a definitive choice. She wanted marriage, wanted them to be together openly, wanted to start their life together without hiding. Meanwhile, at home, Shirley began to notice changes in her husband's behavior. He was frequently distracted, spent long hours on his phone, and seemed emotionally distant. While she attributed much of this to the stress of the threatening letters the family had been receiving, something felt different about Chris, something she couldn't quite identify. By early 2009, Chris Coleman was living two completely separate lives. During the day and when he was home, he played the role of the concerned husband and father, worried about his family's safety due to the ongoing threats. But in his private moments, he was deep in passionate communication with Tara, planning their future together. The threatening letters, meanwhile, continued to arrive. Each one was more disturbing than the last, and they seemed to demonstrate an increasingly intimate knowledge of the family's activities and routines. The local police were treating the threats seriously, but they seemed unable to identify who was sending them or how to stop them. Chris told his supervisors at Joyce Meyer Ministries that he was considering resigning from his position to protect his family. The threats had become so specific and frightening that he felt his continued employment might be putting Sherry and the boys in danger. Joyce Meyer herself was sympathetic to Chris's situation and assured him that the ministry would support whatever decision he felt was best for his family's safety. She had grown to trust Chris over the years and considered him a valuable member of her team, but she understood that family came first. During this period, Chris and Tara's relationship reached a crescendo. They had been together for several months now, and Tara was pressing harder for Chris to make good on his promises of marriage. She had been patient, understanding the complexities of his situation, but her patience was wearing thin. In their phone conversations and text messages, which would later be recovered by police, Chris repeatedly assured Tara that he was going to ask Shuri for a divorce. He told her that he had everything planned out and that soon they would be free to be together openly. What Tara didn't know was the true extent of the obstacles Chris faced. Beyond the professional consequences of divorce, there were financial considerations that weighed heavily on his mind. Divorce would likely mean losing half of his assets, paying child support, and alimony, and potentially having to find a new career. But perhaps most significantly, Chris may have realized that Shuri was unlikely to simply agree to a quiet, amicable divorce. She was a devoted wife and mother who had built her entire life around their family. She would likely fight for their marriage, seek counseling, involve their church community, and generally make the process much more complicated and public than Chris wanted. As winter turned to spring in 2009, Chris found himself facing what seemed like an impossible situation. He wanted to be with Tara, but every path to that goal seemed fraught with devastating consequences. It was sometime during this period that Chris Coleman began to consider a different solution to his problem. A solution that was so horrible, so unthinkable, that it would shock everyone who thought they knew him. Tuesday, May 5th, 2009, began like any other day for the Coleman family, or at least it appeared to. Chris Coleman woke up early, as was his habit, and prepared to go to the gym for his morning workout routine. This was a regular part of his schedule, something he had been doing consistently for months. At approximately 5:40 a.m., Chris left the house on Robert Drive, telling Shuri he would be back after his workout. He drove to the gym in nearby Waterloo, Illinois, about 15 minutes away from their home. What happened next would be reconstructed later through cell phone records, security cameras, and witness testimony, creating a timeline that would become crucial evidence in the case. Chris arrived at the gym and began his workout routine. However, instead of focusing solely on his exercise, he was frequently on his cell phone. Security cameras at the gym would later show him making multiple phone calls during his workout session. Some of these calls were to his work colleagues at Joyce Meyer Ministries. In these conversations, Chris expressed concern about his family's safety, referencing the ongoing threatening letters they had been receiving. He mentioned that he was worried about leaving Shuri and the boys alone at home, and was considering various options to better protect them. But other calls during his workout were to Tara Lintz in Florida. These conversations were markedly different in tone, intimate and personal rather than professional and concerned. At approximately 6:40 a.m., exactly 1 hour after leaving home, Chris made a phone call to the Columbia Police Department. In this call, which was recorded and would later be played in court, Chris asked police to perform a welfare check on his family. Chris told the dispatcher that he had been receiving threatening letters for months, and was concerned because he had tried calling home multiple times that morning, but no one was answering the phone. This was unusual, he explained, because Shuri should have been getting the boys ready for school, and they always answered when he called. The dispatcher assured Chris that officers would be sent to his home immediately to check on his family's welfare. Within minutes, Columbia police officers arrived at 6 Robert Drive. The house appeared quiet from the outside, with no signs of disturbance. However, when officers approached the front door, they made a disturbing discovery. The police officers who responded to Chris Coleman's welfare check request found the front door to the Coleman home unlocked. This was unusual, given the family's heightened security awareness due to the threatening letters they had been receiving. As officers entered the home, they immediately noticed something was wrong. The house was eerily quiet. No sounds of a family preparing for their morning routine. No television, no conversation. But more disturbing were the words they found spray-painted on the walls. Crude, threatening messages were written in red spray paint throughout the downstairs area of the home. These messages were similar in tone and content to the threatening letters the family had been receiving for months. They contained profanity and specific threats against the family members. The officers called for backup and began a systematic search of the house. What they found upstairs would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In the master bedroom, officers found Shuri Coleman. The 31-year-old mother was lying in her bed, still in her pajamas. She had been strangled. There were no signs of sexual assault or robbery, but ligature marks around her neck indicated she had been murdered. Down the hallway, in their shared bedroom, officers found Garrett and Gavin Coleman. The 11-year-old and 9-year-old boys were also in their beds. also still in their pajamas and also victims of strangulation. Like their mother, they showed no signs of struggle, suggesting they may have been asleep when they were killed. The scene was devastating and surreal. Here was a family that had gone to bed the night before, probably feeling safe and secure in their home, only to become victims of what appeared to be the very violence they had been threatened with for months. The house showed no signs of forced entry. Nothing appeared to be stolen. The only evidence of the perpetrator's presence, besides the victims themselves, were the spray-painted messages on the walls. Within an hour of the discovery, the Columbia Police Department had secured the crime scene and begun the process of notifying Chris Coleman that his worst fears had apparently come true. When police contacted Chris Coleman at the gym to inform him of the tragedy, his reaction appeared to be exactly what one would expect from a loving husband and father who had just lost his entire family. Chris was devastated. He broke down completely, sobbing uncontrollably as officers explained what they had found at his home. He kept repeating that this was exactly what he had been afraid of, that the threatening letters had been warning of this exact scenario. Chris was immediately brought to the police station not as a suspect, but as the surviving family member who might be able to provide crucial information about who could have done this to his family. During initial interviews, Chris was cooperative and appeared genuinely grief-stricken. He told officers about the months of threatening letters, the fear his family had been living with, and his regret that he hadn't been home to protect them. He provided details about his morning routine, explaining that he had gone to the gym as usual but had become concerned when his family didn't answer their phones. He emphasized that this was unusual behavior for Sherry, who always answered when he called, especially in the morning when she was getting the boys ready for school. Chris's alibi seemed solid. He had been at the gym, surrounded by security cameras and witnesses during the time period when the murders were estimated to have occurred. He had phone records showing his calls to work colleagues and his call to police requesting the welfare check. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, Chris became the focus of sympathy and support from his community. Friends from church brought food and offered prayers. His colleagues at Joyce Meyer Ministries rallied around him, offering emotional and financial support during his time of grief. Joyce Meyer herself released a public statement expressing her shock and sorrow over the tragedy and asking for prayers for Chris during this impossible time. But even as Chris played the role of the grieving widower, investigators were beginning to notice inconsistencies in his story and behavior that didn't quite add up. The Columbia Police Department had never investigated a triple homicide before. This was far beyond their typical caseload of minor thefts and traffic violations. Recognizing the complexity and nuisance of the case, they immediately called for assistance from the Illinois State Police and the FBI. The initial focus of the investigation was on the threatening letters the family had been receiving. It seemed logical that whoever had been terrorizing the Colemans for months had finally made good on their threats. Investigators began analyzing the letters, looking for fingerprints, DNA evidence, and any clues about the identity of the sender. They examined postmarks, paper types, handwriting, and linguistic patterns that might point to a suspect. They also began interviewing everyone who had knowledge of the threats. Chris's colleagues at Joyce Meyer Ministries, local police officers who had been involved in the security arrangements, neighbors who might have seen suspicious activity, and anyone else who might have relevant information. But as the investigation progressed, investigators began to notice some puzzling aspects of the case. First, there was the question of timing. The murders had occurred during the narrow window when Chris was at the gym, almost as if the perpetrator knew exactly when Chris would be away from home. This could have been a coincidence, but it seemed remarkably convenient for someone who supposedly wanted to kill the entire family. Second, there was the lack of forensic evidence. Despite the brutal nature of the murders, there were no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds on the victims, and no DNA evidence from an intruder. The house showed no signs of forced entry, suggesting that either the perpetrator had a key or that one of the victims had let them in willingly. Third, there were the spray-painted messages themselves. While they were similar in content to the threatening letters, something about them struck investigators as strange. The handwriting was crude and deliberate, almost as if someone was trying to disguise their natural writing style. As investigators dug deeper into the case, they began to expand their focus beyond the obvious suspect, the anonymous letter writer, and started looking more closely at the people closest to the victims. 3 weeks after the murders, on May 26, 2009, investigators made a breakthrough that would change the entire direction of the case. While analyzing Chris Coleman's cell phone records, they discovered something that didn't match his version of events. The records showed that Chris had been in contact with someone in Florida, someone he had been calling and texting regularly for months. That someone was Tara Lynch. When investigators contacted Tara in Florida, they discovered the affair that Chris had been desperately trying to hide. Tara initially tried to protect Chris, but under questioning, she eventually revealed the truth about their relationship. She told investigators that she and Chris had been having an affair since November 2008. She explained that they were deeply in love and had been making plans to marry. In fact, Chris had told her that he was planning to ask Shuri for a divorce on May 4th or 5th, just days before the murders occurred. This revelation completely changed investigators' understanding of the case. Suddenly, Chris Coleman was no longer just the grieving survivor. He was someone with a clear motive to want his family gone. As investigators dug deeper into the affair, they uncovered a wealth of evidence that had been hidden beneath Chris's carefully constructed facade. They found text messages between Chris and Tara that were passionate and intimate. They discovered that Chris had been flying Tara to meet him in various cities during his business trips with Joyce Meyer Ministries. They learned about the promise rings they had exchanged and their detailed plans for marriage. Most significantly, they found communications that suggested Chris had been planning to leave his family well before the murders occurred. But perhaps the most damning discovery came when investigators began to analyze the threatening letters that had been terrorizing the Coleman family for months. Forensic analysis of the threatening letters revealed something shocking. They contained Chris Coleman's own DNA. But it wasn't just DNA evidence that connected Chris to the letters. Linguistic analysis showed writing patterns and word choices that were consistent with Chris's own communication style. Computer forensics revealed that some of the threatening emails had been sent from IP addresses associated with Chris's computer usage. The threatening letters, it appeared, had been sent by Chris Coleman himself. This discovery recontextualized everything investigators thought they knew about the case. The months of fear, the security precautions, the concern for his family's safety. It had all been an elaborate deception designed to create the perfect cover for murder. Investigators theorized that Chris had been sending the threatening letters to establish a pattern of outside threats against his family. When the murders occurred, he would appear to be just another victim of the same person who had been terrorizing them for months. But why would Chris want to kill his own family? The answer lay in the impossible situation he had created for himself through his affair with Tara Lynch. Chris wanted to be with Tara, but he couldn't simply divorce Sherry without potentially losing his job, his financial security, and his reputation. A messy divorce would likely become public knowledge within their church community and could have serious professional consequences given the moral standards expected of Joyce Meyer Ministries employees. More significantly, divorce would mean Chris would have to pay child support and alimony, reducing his income substantially. It would also mean sharing custody of his children, which would complicate his ability to travel and maintain his lifestyle with Tara. But if his family were murdered by the same person who had been threatening them, Chris would become a sympathetic figure worthy of support and assistance. He would inherit Shuri's life insurance, keep all of their joint assets, and be free to marry Tara without any of the complications that divorce would have entailed. It was a plan that might have worked if Chris hadn't made several crucial mistakes. As the evidence against Chris Coleman mounted, investigators faced the challenging task of building an airtight case against him. They knew that the circumstantial nature of much of their evidence meant they would need to be thorough and methodical in their approach. They continued to analyze every aspect of Chris's story, looking for inconsistencies and contradictions. They re-interviewed witnesses, re-examined physical evidence, and consulted with forensic experts to ensure they had the strongest possible case. One of the key pieces of evidence was the timeline of events on the morning of May 5th, while Chris's alibi placed him at the gym during the estimated time of the murders. Investigators discovered that the timeline was much tighter than initially thought. Security footage from the gym showed that Chris had arrived and left within a narrow window that would have given him just enough time to drive home, kill his family, spray paint the messages on the walls, and return to the gym before calling police. Phone records showed that Chris had made his call to police requesting the welfare check exactly 1 hour after leaving home for the gym. A precision of timing that seemed remarkably convenient. On May 19, 2009, 2 weeks after the murders, Chris Coleman was arrested at his parents' home in Chester, Illinois. He was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of his wife Sherry and sons Garrett and Gavin. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community that had rallied around Chris in his time of supposed grief. Friends who had brought him meals and offered prayers suddenly found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about the man they had been supporting. Joyce Meyer Ministries issued a statement expressing their shock and disappointment while emphasizing that they would cooperate fully with the investigation. Chris Coleman pleaded not guilty to all charges. The trial of Christopher Coleman began in April 2011, nearly 2 years after the murders. The delay was due in part to the complexity of the case and the extensive forensic analysis required to build the prosecution's case. The prosecution, led by the Monroe County State's Attorney's Office, painted a picture of a man who had become so obsessed with his mistress and so desperate to escape his family obligations that he was willing to commit the ultimate betrayal. They presented evidence of the affair with Tara Lintz, including passionate text messages and emails that showed the depth of Chris's commitment to their relationship. They showed how Chris had been planning to ask for a divorce just days before the murders occurred. Most damning was the evidence connecting Chris to the threatening letters. Prosecutors argued that Chris had spent months carefully constructing an elaborate deception, sending threatening letters to his own family to create the appearance of an outside threat. The prosecution's case was methodical and comprehensive. They presented DNA evidence, computer forensics, phone records, and witness testimony that piece by piece built a picture of Chris Coleman as a calculated killer who had murdered his own family to escape the responsibilities of marriage and fatherhood. The defense, meanwhile, argued that the evidence against Chris was circumstantial and that the real killer was still at large. They suggested that the investigation had focused too quickly on Chris and had missed other potential suspects. They pointed to the lack of physical evidence placing Chris at the scene during the time of the murders, and argued that his alibi at the gym was solid. They suggested that someone else could have sent the threatening letters, and that Chris was being framed for crimes he didn't commit. But the defense faced an uphill battle. The evidence of Chris's affair provided a clear motive, and the forensic evidence connecting him to the threatening letters was difficult to explain away. Perhaps most damaging to the defense was Tara Lintz's testimony. When she took the stand, she described in detail her relationship with Chris and his promises that he would soon be free to marry her. She testified that Chris had told her he was planning to present Sherry with divorce papers on May 4th or 5th, the exact time frame when the murders occurred. After hearing weeks of testimony and examining hundreds of pieces of evidence, the jury began deliberations on May 4th, 2011, exactly 2 years after Chris Coleman had allegedly told Tara Lintz that he would be asking his wife for a divorce. The jury deliberated for 15 hours over 2 days, carefully considering the prosecution's case against the defense's arguments for reasonable doubt. On May 5th, 2011, exactly 2 years to the day after Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin Coleman were murdered, the jury returned their verdict: guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom was filled with emotion as the verdicts were read. Members of Sherry's family wept openly, finally seeing justice for the woman and children who had been taken from them so brutally. Chris Coleman showed little reaction to the verdicts, maintaining the stoic demeanor he had displayed throughout much of the trial. The conviction meant that Chris Coleman would face a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole for each count of murder. 3 days later, on May 9, 2011, Chris Coleman appeared before the judge for sentencing. In a brief statement, he continued to maintain his innocence, saying that he loved his family and would never have hurt them. The judge sentenced Chris Coleman to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life in prison for the murders of his wife and children. The Coleman family murders sent shockwaves through the community of Columbia, Illinois, and beyond. For a small town where violent crime was rare, the idea that a father could kill his own family was almost incomprehensible. The case also had significant implications for Joyce Meyer Ministries. The organization had trusted Chris Coleman with the security of their most valuable asset, Joyce Meyer herself. The revelation that he was capable of such violence raised difficult questions about background checks and employee vetting procedures. Joyce Meyer herself expressed deep sorrow over the tragedy and regret that she had not somehow seen the warning signs in Chris's behavior. She established a fund to help with funeral expenses and to support other family members affected by the tragedy. For Tara Lintz, the woman who had unwittingly become entangled in Chris Coleman's murderous plot, the aftermath was particularly difficult. She had to live with the knowledge that her relationship with Chris had somehow contributed to the deaths of 3 innocent people, including a woman who had once been her friend. Tara testified that she had no knowledge of Chris's plans, and that she was horrified to learn what he had done. Nevertheless, she struggled with guilt and regret over her role in the tragedy. The extended family members of Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin Coleman were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. They had lost not only their beloved family members, but also their faith in someone they had trusted and considered family. Sherry's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Chris Coleman, seeking financial damages for their loss. While no amount of money could bring back their loved ones, they hoped to ensure that Chris could never profit from his crimes. Chris Coleman was sent to the Menard Correctional Center in southern Illinois to serve his 3 consecutive life sentences. At 34 years old at the time of his sentencing, he faced the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison. In the years following his conviction, Chris has continued to maintain his innocence. He has given interviews to various media outlets, including the television show Crime Watch Daily, where he proclaimed that he loved his family and would never have hurt them. Chris has claimed that he was framed for the murders, and that the real killer is still at large. He has suggested that the investigation was flawed and that evidence pointing to other suspects was ignored in the rush to convict him. However, these claims have been met with skepticism by law enforcement officials and legal experts who have reviewed the case. The evidence against Chris Coleman was extensive and compelling, including physical evidence, forensic analysis, and clear motive. Several appeals have been filed on Chris's behalf, but none have been successful. The Illinois Appellate Court upheld his convictions in 2014. Finding that the evidence was sufficient to support the jury's verdict, and that Chris had received a fair trial. Chris's father, Ron Coleman, has remained steadfast in his belief in his son's innocence. He has continued to advocate for Chris, and has suggested that the real killer is still free while his innocent son languishes in prison. But for most people familiar with the case, including law enforcement officials, prosecutors, and the jury that heard all the evidence, there is no doubt about Chris Coleman's guilt. The Coleman family murders serve as a tragic reminder of how secret lives and hidden deceptions can lead to devastating consequences. Chris Coleman appeared to be a devoted husband and father, a respected security professional, and a faithful member of his church community. Yet beneath this carefully constructed exterior lay a man capable of the most heinous crimes imaginable. The case highlights the danger of assuming that we truly know the people closest to us. Sherry Coleman went to bed on the night of May 4th, 2009. Believing she was safe in her home with her loving husband nearby. She had no way of knowing that the man she had pledged to love, honor, and cherish had already decided that she and their children were obstacles to be eliminated. The murders also demonstrate how modern technology and forensic science can unravel even carefully planned deceptions. Chris Coleman thought he had created the perfect cover story with months of threatening letters and a solid alibi. But DNA evidence, computer forensics, and cell phone records ultimately revealed the truth behind his elaborate charade. For the law enforcement officials who worked on this case, it was a sobering reminder of the complexity of human nature and the depths to which some people will sink to get what they want. Detective Jason Donjon of the Illinois State Police, who was instrumental in solving the case, has said that the Coleman murders were among the most disturbing cases of his career because of the betrayal of trust involved. The case also raises questions about the pressures that some people face in trying to maintain perfect public images, while struggling with private desires and conflicts. Chris Coleman felt trapped between his public persona as a devoted family man and his private desire to be with another woman. Rather than finding an honest way to resolve this conflict, he chose the most cowardly and evil solution possible. As we conclude this tragic story, it's important to remember that at the center of this case are 3 innocent victims who lost their lives far too soon. Sherry Coleman was 31 years old when she was murdered. She was described by those who knew her as a loving mother, devoted wife, and kind friend. She had given up her own career ambitions to focus on raising Garrett and Gavin, and by all accounts, she was an exceptional mother who adored her children. Garrett Coleman was 11 years old, a bright boy who loved sports and was doing well in school. He had his whole life ahead of him, filled with possibilities and potential that will never be realized. Gavin Coleman was 9 years old, described as energetic and full of life. Like his older brother, he was a good student who enjoyed playing with friends and spending time with his family. These 3 people trusted Chris Coleman completely. Sherry had built her entire adult life around their marriage and family. Garrett and Gavin looked up to their father as their protector and hero. None of them could have imagined that the person they trusted most in the world would become the instrument of their deaths. Their murders represent not just the loss of 3 lives, but the destruction of dreams, the shattering of trust, and the elimination of all the joy and love they might have brought to the world in the years to come. Today, Chris Coleman sits in a prison cell, serving 3 consecutive life sentences for the murders of his wife and children. He has lost everything: his freedom, his reputation, his family, and any hope of the future he thought he wanted with Tara Lynch. Meanwhile, somewhere in Illinois, there are 3 graves that serve as a permanent reminder of the terrible price of betrayal and the devastating consequences of choosing evil over good. The Coleman family murders will be remembered as one of the most shocking cases of familicide in Illinois history. A reminder that the greatest danger sometimes comes from those we trust the most. Please, if this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to the channel where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight we journey to Knoxville, Tennessee, to explore a case that shook a quiet community and revealed the dark reality behind what appeared to be a picture-perfect high school romance. This is the story of Emma Walker, a 16-year-old cheerleader whose life was tragically cut short in November of 2016. In the heart of Tennessee, Knoxville is the kind of place where high school football games are community events, where autumn Friday nights bring together families under stadium lights, and where the red and black colors of Central High School create a sea of school spirit in the stands. It was in this wholesome setting that Emma Jane Walker lived what many would consider the ideal teenage life. Emma was everything you might imagine when picturing the all-American girl next door. At 16, she was a dedicated cheerleader for Central High School, known for her bright smile and infectious energy. Standing on the sidelines in her cheerleading uniform, Emma embodied the spirit of youth and possibility. She had long, flowing hair that caught the light during games, and eyes that sparkled with the kind of optimism that only comes with being young and believing the world is full of endless opportunities. Those who knew Emma described her as genuinely kind-hearted, the type of person who could light up a room simply by walking into it. She wasn't just popular because of her role as a cheerleader, but because she had a natural warmth that drew people to her. Teachers spoke of her dedication to her studies. Friends remembered her loyalty and genuine care for others. And family members cherished her as the heart of their close-knit family unit. Emma lived in the Sturkey Hills neighborhood of Knoxville, a quiet suburban area where families knew their neighbors and children could walk to school without worry. The Walker family home sat on a tree-lined street, the kind of place where kids rode bicycles on summer afternoons and neighbors waved to each other from their front porches. It was the epitome of safe, small-town America, where the most exciting Friday night event was the high school football game. It was at one of these very football games that Emma's story intersected with that of William Riley Gall, a player who would ultimately become the central figure in her tragic end. Riley, as he was known to friends and teammates, was 2 years older than Emma, a senior when she was just a sophomore. He played wide receiver for the Central High School football team, and like Emma, he seemed to embody the ideal of American teenage success. Riley was tall and athletic, with the kind of build that made him stand out on the football field. He had dark hair and carried himself with the confidence that often comes with being a successful high school athlete. To outsiders, he appeared to be everything a teenage girl might dream of in a boyfriend. Popular, athletic, charming, and from all appearances devoted to Emma. Their relationship began in the typical fashion of high school romances. They met through the natural overlap of football and cheerleading, those two pillars of American high school social life. Emma would cheer from the sidelines while Riley played on the field. And after games, they would find each other in the parking lot or at team celebrations. To their classmates, teachers, and even their families, they seemed like the perfect couple, the football player and the cheerleader, living out what appeared to be a storybook high school romance. For nearly 2 years, Emma and Riley were an on-again, off-again couple, the kind of relationship that seemed intense and passionate to their teenage eyes. They would break up over typical high school drama, only to reunite days or weeks later, more committed than ever. This pattern became so familiar to their friends that many stopped taking their breakups seriously, assuming that, like always, they would be back together within a matter of days. But as their relationship progressed, subtle changes began to emerge that would later be recognized as warning signs. Friends and family members who were close to Emma started to notice that Riley's attention toward her was becoming increasingly intense. moving beyond normal teenage devotion into something that felt more possessive and controlling. Emma's friends began to observe that Riley seemed to always need to know where she was, whom she was with, and what she was doing. If she went out with girlfriends, he would text her constantly throughout the evening. If she talked to other boys, even in the context of normal school interactions, Riley would become visibly upset and would later confront her about it. What had initially seemed like caring attention gradually revealed itself to be surveillance and control. Emma's family also began to notice changes in her behavior when she was with Riley. The vibrant, confident girl they knew would become quieter, more anxious, and seemed to be constantly checking her phone, as if she were afraid of missing his messages or calls. During family gatherings, she would step away frequently to respond to texts, and there were times when her mood would shift suddenly after receiving a message, as if she had been reprimanded or criticized. The volatile nature of their relationship became more apparent as Emma grew older and began to develop a stronger sense of herself and what she wanted from life. As she matured from a naive freshman into a more confident sophomore and then junior, Emma began to recognize that the relationship dynamics with Riley were not healthy. She started to understand that his possessiveness wasn't romantic devotion, but rather a form of control that was stifling her growth and happiness. Friends noticed that Emma began to express doubts about the relationship more frequently. She would confide in her closest friends about feeling suffocated, about Riley's anger when she wanted to spend time with other people, and about his tendency to make her feel guilty for wanting independence. These conversations became more frequent as Emma approached her junior year, and Riley prepared to graduate and move on to college. When Riley graduated from Central High School and enrolled at Maryville College, a small Division III school located about 20 miles south of Knoxville, many hoped that the physical distance might help their relationship evolve into something healthier, or perhaps naturally fade away as they both focused on new chapters of their lives. Maryville College was known for its strong academic programs and its small, close-knit campus community, and Riley had earned a spot on the football team as a wide receiver. However, instead of the distance providing breathing room for both of them, it seemed to intensify Riley's need to maintain control over Emma. The 40-minute drive between Knoxville and Maryville might as well have been a 40-minute period of anxiety for Riley, who became increasingly paranoid about what Emma was doing when he wasn't there to monitor her activities. Riley's behavior during his freshman year of college became increasingly erratic and concerning. He would drive from Maryville to Knoxville unannounced, showing up at Emma's house or school without warning. He would demand to know details about her day, her interactions with classmates, and her plans for the weekend. If Emma didn't respond to his text immediately, he would send multiple follow-up messages, each one more urgent and angry than the last. Emma's friends and family began to see more clearly the unhealthy dynamics of the relationship. What had once been dismissed as typical teenage drama was now recognized as patterns of emotional abuse and stalking behavior. Emma herself was growing tired of the constant demands on her time and attention, and she began to seriously consider ending the relationship permanently. The breaking point came in November of 2016, just a few days before Thanksgiving break. Emma, now a junior at Central High School, had been contemplating the decision for weeks, discussing it with her closest friends and family members, who had been encouraging her to prioritize her own well-being and happiness. She had come to realize that the relationship was preventing her from enjoying her junior year, from forming new friendships, and from focusing on her future plans. On a day that seemed like any other, Emma made the decision to end her relationship with Riley once and for all. This wasn't another one of their temporary breakups that everyone expected would be resolved within days. This was Emma's attempt to permanently close this chapter of her life and move forward independently. The conversation took place over the phone, with Emma speaking calmly but firmly about her decision. She explained to Riley that she needed space to focus on herself, her education, and her future. She told him that their relationship had become too intense and controlling, and that she needed to be free to make her own choices about how to spend her time and with whom she wanted to associate. Riley's reaction to this final breakup was unlike his responses to their previous temporary separations. Instead of the typical cycle of anger, followed by attempts to win her back with romantic gestures, Riley seemed to understand that Emma was serious this time. But rather than accepting her decision with maturity, he became increasingly desperate and erratic in his attempts to change her mind. In the days following the breakup, Riley's behavior escalated in ways that alarmed Emma and those close to her. He would call and text her constantly, sometimes dozens of times per day. His messages alternated between professions of love and promises to change, and angry accusations about her loyalty and commitment to their relationship. When Emma stopped responding to his messages, Riley began showing up places where he knew she would be. At school, at her home, at her friends' houses. Emma confided in her friends and family that Riley's behavior was making her feel unsafe and anxious. She had hoped that ending the relationship cleanly and honestly would allow them both to move on, but instead it seemed to have triggered something darker in Riley's personality. She began to vary her routines, asking friends to accompany her places where she would normally go alone, and she started checking over her shoulder more frequently, always aware that Riley might appear unexpectedly. The stalking behavior continued and intensified throughout November. Riley would drive from his college campus to Knoxville, sometimes multiple times per week, to try to encounter Emma. He would wait outside her school, follow her car, and show up at locations where she was spending time with friends. When direct confrontations didn't work, he began to employ more manipulative tactics. Riley started reaching out to Emma's friends and family members, trying to convince them to intervene on his behalf. He would tell them that he was devastated by the breakup, that he couldn't live without Emma, and that he was considering hurting himself if she didn't give him another chance. This emotional manipulation put Emma's loved ones in an impossible position. They wanted to support Emma's decision to end the relationship, but they were also concerned about Riley's mental state and the dramatic declarations he was making. Emma found herself caught between her desire to move on with her life and her concern for Riley's well-being. Despite recognizing that his behavior was inappropriate and concerning, she still cared about him as someone she had once loved, and she didn't want him to harm himself. This internal conflict kept her engaged in conversations and interactions that she would have preferred to avoid entirely. As November progressed and Thanksgiving approached, Riley's behavior became even more unpredictable and frightening. He began making vague threats, not necessarily directed at Emma, but suggesting that he was capable of violence if pushed too far. He spoke about feeling like he had nothing left to live for, about the unfairness of Emma's decision, and about his anger toward anyone who had influenced her to end their relationship. Emma confided in her aunt, Jenny Weldon, about her growing fear of Riley's behavior. She explained that he wasn't respecting her wishes to end the relationship, that he was continuing to contact her despite her request to stop, and that his presence in her life was becoming increasingly intrusive and frightening. Emma's family began to understand that this wasn't simply a case of a lovesick teenager having trouble accepting rejection, but rather a dangerous escalation of stalking and harassment. The situation came to a head on the night of November 21, 2016. Emma had spent a quiet evening at home in the Sturkey Hills neighborhood, probably looking forward to the Thanksgiving break that was just days away. She had plans with friends, schoolwork to complete, and the normal concerns of a 16-year-old junior in high school. There was no indication that this night would be any different from hundreds of other peaceful evenings in her family's comfortable suburban home. Emma went to bed that night in her bedroom, a space that represented safety and privacy in her young life. Her room was decorated with the typical items you might expect from a teenage girl. Photographs of friends, school memorabilia, cheerleading awards, and the personal items that made the space uniquely hers. It was in this sanctuary, surrounded by the familiar objects of her daily life, that Emma settled down to sleep, unaware that Riley was somewhere outside in the darkness. What happened next would shatter the peaceful quiet of the Sturkey Hills neighborhood, and destroy the lives of everyone who loved Emma. Sometime during the night, as Emma slept peacefully in her bed, Riley crept through the darkness toward the Walker family home. He had driven from Maryville to Knoxville, making the journey that he had made so many times before, but this time with a deadly intention. Riley positioned himself outside Emma's bedroom window, in the shadows where he could see into her room but remain hidden from view. In his possession was a handgun, a weapon that would transform his obsession and anger into an irreversible act of violence. Standing there in the darkness, looking into the bedroom where Emma slept peacefully, Riley made the decision that would end her life and destroy his own. He fired 2 bullets through the wall of the house, aiming toward Emma's bedroom. The shots rang out in the quiet night, shattering the peace of the suburban neighborhood, and alerting the Walker family that something terrible had happened. One of the bullets found its target, striking Emma behind her left ear as she lay sleeping. The second bullet lodged in her pillow, a chilling reminder of how close this attack came to being even more devastating. The Walker family woke to the sound of gunshots and immediately rushed to Emma's room, where they found their daughter mortally wounded. In the panic and confusion of those first moments, they called for emergency medical services, hoping against hope that Emma might survive this incomprehensible attack. But the bullet had caused catastrophic damage, And despite the quick response of paramedics, Emma Walker was pronounced dead. Her young life ended by the violence of someone who claimed to love her. Initially, the shooting appeared to be a random act of violence, perhaps a break-in gone wrong, or a case of mistaken identity. The idea that someone would specifically target Emma seemed incomprehensible to her family, friends, and the investigating officers. Emma was well-liked, had no known enemies, and lived in a safe neighborhood where violent crime was virtually unheard of. The randomness of the attack made it even more terrifying for the community. But as investigators from the Knox County Sheriff's Office began to piece together the evidence and interview Emma's family and friends, a clearer picture began to emerge. Emma's family immediately mentioned their concerns about Riley's behavior following their recent breakup. They described his escalating stalking, his refusal to accept Emma's decision to end the relationship, and the growing fear that Emma had expressed about his unpredictable behavior. The investigation quickly focused on Riley as the primary suspect, and detectives began to build a case against him. They discovered that Riley had no alibi for the time of the shooting, and that he had made the drive from Maryville to Knoxville on the night Emma was killed. Physical evidence at the scene, including the trajectory of the bullets and the specific location from which they were fired, supported the theory that the shooter had intimate knowledge of Emma's bedroom and daily routines. But perhaps the most damaging evidence against Riley came from an unexpected source: his own friends and teammates. In the days following Emma's murder, Riley confided in two of his college friends about his involvement in the shooting. These friends, initially bound by loyalty and disbelief, eventually came forward to assist law enforcement in building their case against Riley. According to the testimony that would later be presented in court, Riley had approached these friends shortly after the shooting, asking for their help in disposing of the murder weapon. He had also made statements that implicated him directly in Emma's death, providing details about the crime that only the perpetrator would have known. These friends found themselves in an impossible situation, torn between loyalty to someone they had considered a friend and their moral obligation to seek justice for Emma. The friends ultimately made the difficult decision to cooperate with law enforcement, agreeing to participate in a sting operation that would provide investigators with the evidence they needed to arrest Riley. This cooperation required tremendous courage, as they were essentially turning against someone they had trusted, but their decision to come forward was crucial in ensuring that Emma's killer would face justice. On December 9, 2016, just over 2 weeks after Emma's murder, Riley Gall was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, among other charges. The arrest came as the result of the sting operation involving his friends, who had worked with investigators to gather incriminating statements and evidence. Riley's arrest sent shockwaves through both the Maryville College and Central High School communities, as people struggled to reconcile the image of the clean-cut college football player with the reality of what he had done. The case against Riley was built on a combination of physical evidence, witness testimony, and his own incriminating statements to friends. Investigators were able to establish that he had the means, motive, and opportunity to commit the crime. They demonstrated that his escalating stalking behavior following the breakup provided a clear motive, that he had access to the weapon used in the shooting, and that he had no alibi for the time of Emma's murder. As the case moved through the legal system, more details emerged about the toxic nature of Riley and Emma's relationship. Friends, family members, and classmates testified about the controlling and possessive behavior that had characterized their relationship, particularly in the months leading up to Emma's death. This testimony painted a picture of a young woman who had been trying to break free from an abusive relationship, only to have that decision cost her life. The trial of Riley Gall began in May 2018, nearly a year and a half after Emma's murder. The prosecution presented a compelling case that portrayed Riley as an obsessive ex-boyfriend who had escalated from stalking and harassment to murder when he realized that Emma was serious about ending their relationship permanently. They argued that Riley's actions on the night of November 25, 2016, were the culmination of weeks of increasingly desperate and dangerous behavior. The defense attempted to argue that the shooting was accidental, that Riley had intended only to frighten Emma into taking him back, not to kill her. They suggested that he had fired the shots to scare her, never intending for the bullets to actually strike her. However, this argument was undermined by the precision of the shooting and the intimate knowledge of Emma's bedroom layout that would have been required to carry out the attack. The testimony during the trial was emotional and often difficult to hear, as Emma's family and friends were forced to relive the trauma of her death and describe the fear she had experienced in her final weeks. They spoke about the vibrant, loving young woman who had been taken from them, and about the promising future that had been cut short by Riley's selfish and violent actions. On May 8, 2018, after deliberating for several hours, the jury returned with a guilty verdict on all counts, including first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in gasps and tears as the verdict was read, providing a sense of justice for Emma's family, while simultaneously acknowledging that no legal outcome could ever truly compensate for their devastating loss. Riley Gall was immediately sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 51 years. This sentence ensured that he would spend the majority, if not all, of his remaining life behind bars, paying for the decision he made on that November night in 2016. At the time of his sentencing, Riley was just 19 years old, meaning he would be at least 70 years old before he could even be considered for parole. The impact of Emma's murder extended far beyond her immediate family and friends, though their loss remained at the center of this tragedy. The case became a stark reminder of the dangers of domestic violence and teen dating violence, highlighting how relationships that appear normal on the surface can hide patterns of abuse and control that escalate to deadly violence. Emma's story became part of educational programs designed to help young people recognize the warning signs of abusive relationships and understand that possessive, controlling behavior is not a sign of love, but rather a red flag that should not be ignored. Her case was featured in numerous true crime programs and documentaries, ensuring that her story would continue to serve as a warning to others who might find themselves in similar situations. The Walker family, while devastated by their loss, channeled their grief into advocacy and awareness efforts. They spoke publicly about the warning signs they had observed in Riley's behavior, encouraging other families to take seriously any concerns about controlling or possessive partners in their children's lives. Their courage in sharing Emma's story helped shine a light on the often hidden problem of teen dating violence. For the Knoxville community, Emma's murder shattered the sense of safety and innocence that had characterized life in their quiet suburban neighborhood. Parents found themselves having difficult conversations with their own teenagers about healthy relationships, personal safety, and the importance of speaking up when they observed concerning behavior in their peers. The case also highlighted the crucial role that friends and bystanders can play in preventing violence and ensuring justice when crimes occur. The two college friends who ultimately came forward to help investigators were initially criticized by some for their delay in reporting what they knew, but their eventual cooperation was instrumental in securing Riley's conviction. Their story served as an example of how difficult it can be to do the right thing when it means betraying someone you care about, but also how essential such courage can be in the pursuit of justice. Riley's life, like Emma's, was forever changed by the events of November 21, 2016. Though obviously in very different ways. From a promising college football player with his whole life ahead of him, he became a convicted murderer facing decades in prison. His story serves as a cautionary tale about how unchecked anger, obsession, and entitlement can lead to irreversible and devastating consequences. In the years following his conviction, Riley has made several attempts to appeal his sentence and secure a new trial, arguing various legal technicalities and claiming that he did not receive adequate representation during his original trial. As recently as 2025, he was seeking post-conviction relief, claiming ineffective counsel during his 2018 trial. However, these efforts have been consistently denied by the courts, and Riley remains incarcerated, serving his life sentence. The story of Emma Walker serves as a sobering reminder that domestic violence and intimate partner violence can affect anyone, regardless of age, social status, or community. Emma appeared to have everything going for her. She was popular, successful in school, surrounded by loving family and friends, and living in a safe, supportive community. Yet none of these protective factors could shield her from the violence of someone who claimed to love her, but ultimately saw her as a possession to be controlled, rather than a person with her own autonomy and right to make decisions about her own life. Emma's case also illustrates how domestic violence often escalates when the victim attempts to leave the relationship. Statistics show that the most dangerous time for someone in an abusive relationship is when they try to end it, as the abuser's sense of control is threatened and their behavior can become increasingly desperate and violent. Emma's decision to permanently end her relationship with Riley, while healthy and appropriate, unfortunately triggered exactly this kind of escalation. The neighborhood where Emma lived, Starchy Hills, eventually returned to its quiet suburban rhythms. But the memory of that November night serves as a permanent reminder that violence can intrude even into the most peaceful and seemingly safe environments. The house where Emma lived became a place of pilgrimage for some, a reminder for others of the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing the people we love. For those who knew Emma personally, the loss remains profound and permanent. Her friends from the cheerleading squad graduated without her, attended college without her, and continue to mark the milestones of their lives with the knowledge that Emma will never have the opportunity to experience these same passages. Her family faces every holiday, birthday, and anniversary with the acute awareness of her absence, while simultaneously working to honor her memory and ensure that her story continues to help others. The case of Emma Walker reminds us that behind every true crime story, there are real people whose lives have been forever altered by violence. Emma was not just a victim in a crime story, but a vibrant young woman with dreams, aspirations, and people who loved her deeply. Her life mattered not because of how it ended, but because of how she lived it, with kindness, energy, and the kind of optimism that should characterize every 16-year-old's view of the world. As we conclude this story, we remember Emma Jane Walker not as a victim of violence, but as a young woman who deserved to live, to grow up, to attend college, to fall in love with someone who would treat her with respect and kindness, to pursue her dreams, and to experience all the joys and challenges that life had to offer. Her story serves as both a tragedy and a call to action, reminding us all to be vigilant for the signs of controlling and abusive behavior, to support those who find themselves in dangerous relationships, and to never take for granted the preciousness of the lives and safety of those we hold dear. The autumn Friday night lights still shine on Central High School's football field, and cheerleaders still take the field to support their team. But for those who remember Emma Walker, those lights will always carry a touch of sadness, a reminder of the bright light that was extinguished too soon, and a call to ensure that no other young person suffers the same fate. In the quiet moments before sleep, we might remember Emma's smile, her school spirit, and the promise of her young life. We might think about the importance of recognizing love from control, support from possession, and care from obsession. And perhaps, in remembering Emma's story, we can honor her memory by working to create a world where young people can love and be loved safely, where breakups are part of growing up rather than triggers for violence, and where every 16-year-old has the chance to see what their future might hold. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight I want to tell you about a case that shook the quiet community of Quitman County, Mississippi, in the winter of 1990. It's a story of an ordinary family whose lives were tragically cut short, and the investigation that followed to bring justice for the Parker family. Picture rural Mississippi in 1990. Quitman County was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other, where children could play outside without fear, and where the most excitement might be the high school football game on Friday nights. It was a community built on trust, where front doors were often left unlocked and strangers were greeted with Southern hospitality. The Parker family lived in this peaceful corner of Mississippi. Carl Parker was a hard-working man who provided for his family through honest labor. His wife, Bobby Jo, was known for her warm smile and her dedication to their children. Together, they were raising 2 young ones. Gregory, who at 12 years old was just discovering his place in the world, and Charlotte, a bright 9-year-old girl with her whole life ahead of her. Like many families in rural Mississippi, the Parkers lived modestly but comfortably. Their home was a sanctuary where family dinners were shared, where homework was done at the kitchen table, and where bedtime stories were read by lamplight. It was an ordinary American family, living an ordinary American life, unaware that their peaceful existence was about to be shattered. The morning of February 2nd, 1990, dawned like any other winter day in Mississippi. The air was crisp, carrying the promise of spring still weeks away. Carl Parker likely rose early, as working men do, preparing for another day of providing for his family. Bobby Jo would have been getting the children ready for school, ensuring Gregory had his books and Charlotte had eaten a proper breakfast. But this day would not unfold like the thousands of ordinary days that had come before it. Somewhere else in Mississippi, 2 men were making plans that would forever alter the course of multiple lives. Anthony Carr and Robert Simon were not strangers to trouble with the law. Both men had histories that painted pictures of lives that had taken wrong turns, of choices that led down darker paths. Carr and Simon had decided to commit a robbery. Perhaps they were motivated by desperation, by the need for quick money, or perhaps by something more sinister. What we know for certain is that their target was not chosen through careful planning or intimate knowledge of their victims. The Parker family was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, living in a house that two criminals had marked for their crime. The details of how Kara and Simon selected the Parker home remain part of the investigation's findings. But what happened next would become a matter of court record, witness testimony, and evidence that would be presented before juries who would ultimately decide the fate of these two men. When Kara and Simon approached the Parker family home that February evening, they likely expected to find an empty house. Many burglaries happen this way. Criminals wait for families to leave, then slip inside to take what they can before escaping into the night. But the Parker family was home. What began as a robbery quickly escalated into something far more sinister and tragic. The evidence presented in court would later reveal the horrific sequence of events that unfolded within those walls. Carl Parker, the family patriarch, was confronted by the intruders. His wife Bobby Jo and their two children, Gregory and Charlotte, were also in the home when Kara and Simon entered. The details that emerged during the investigation painted a picture of unspeakable violence. The evidence showed that the family members were restrained, bound by the perpetrators who had invaded their sanctuary. What should have been a simple theft had become a nightmare of violence and terror. Young Charlotte Parker, just 9 years old, became the victim of sexual assault. The medical examiner would later testify about the evidence of this horrific crime against a child who should have been safe in her own home. Then came the murders. Carl Parker was shot and killed. His wife Bobby Jo was also shot and killed. 12-year-old Gregory, barely on the threshold of becoming a teenager, was shot and killed. And finally, 9-year-old Charlotte, who had already endured unspeakable trauma, was also shot and killed. But the perpetrators were not finished. In an apparent attempt to cover their tracks and destroy evidence, Kara and Simon set the house on fire. The flames that engulfed the Parker family home were intended to hide the evidence of their crimes, to make the scene look like a tragic accident rather than the quadruple homicide it truly was. However, the investigation would later reveal a crucial detail that would prove significant in the prosecution's case. The medical examiner determined that Charlotte Parker had not died from her gunshot wounds. Instead, the cause of death was smoke inhalation. This meant that the 9-year-old child had survived the shooting only to die in the fire that consumed her family's home. This detail would haunt investigators, prosecutors, and ultimately the community. It meant that Charlotte Parker's final moments were spent breathing smoke and flames, alone and terrified after watching her family murdered before her eyes. When firefighters and law enforcement responded to the blaze at the Parker family home, they initially approached it as they would any house fire, but as the smoke cleared and investigators began to examine the scene, it became apparent that this was no accidental fire. The bodies of the Parker family were discovered among the ruins of their home. The positioning of the bodies, the evidence of gunshot wounds, and the pattern of the fire all pointed to something far more sinister than a tragic accident. The Mississippi State Crime Laboratory was called in to process the evidence. Investigators combed through the charred remains of the Parker home, carefully collecting and cataloging every piece of potential evidence. Bullets were recovered from the bodies and the scene. The pattern of the fire was analyzed to determine its origin and cause. Meanwhile, law enforcement began the painstaking process of investigating the murders. They interviewed neighbors, looking for anyone who might have seen suspicious activity around the Parker home. They examined the family's background, searching for any enemies or anyone who might have had reason to harm them. What they found was exactly what they expected. The Parkers were a well-liked family with no known enemies. Carl Parker was described by neighbors as a hard-working man who kept to himself and took care of his family. Bobby Jo was remembered as a kind woman who was devoted to her children. Gregory and Charlotte were typical children who played with their friends and attended school regularly. This was not a case where the victims had somehow brought violence upon themselves through their associations or activities. This was a random crime committed against an innocent family by strangers who had invaded their home with evil intent. Investigations into crimes like these often hinge on small details, witness observations, and forensic evidence. In the Parker family murder case, investigators began to develop leads that would eventually point them toward Anthony Carr and Robert Simon. The exact details of how investigators first identified Kara and Simon as suspects involved police work that unfolded over days and weeks following the murders. It might have been a witness who remembered seeing unfamiliar vehicles in the area. It could have been physical evidence left at the scene that connected to the perpetrators. Or perhaps it was tips from the community as word spread about the horrific crime and people began to remember conversations or behaviors that seemed suspicious in hindsight. What we know for certain is that by early February 1990, just days after the murders, investigators had identified Anthony Carr and Robert Simon as their primary suspects. Robert Simon was arrested first on February 3, 1990 in Clarksdale, Mississippi. He was charged with the capital murder of Charlotte Jo Parker as well as sexual battery and kidnapping. The speed of his arrest just one day after the murders suggests that investigators had developed strong evidence linking him to the crime. Anthony Carr was also arrested in connection with the murders. Like Simon, he faced multiple charges related to the deaths of the Parker family members. The legal proceedings in the Parker family murder case would prove to be complex, involving multiple trials and jurisdictions. Mississippi law at the time required separate proceedings for different aspects of the crime, and both Carr and Simon faced multiple charges that had to be addressed individually. On March 12, 1990, Robert Simon was indicted by a Quitman County grand jury for his role in the murders. The indictment included charges of capital murder, sexual battery, and kidnapping in connection with the death of 9-year-old Charlotte Parker. The prosecution's case against Simon was built on the evidence collected from the crime scene, witness testimony, and the results of the forensic investigation. The medical examiner testified about the cause of Charlotte's death and the evidence of sexual assault. Ballistics experts testified about the bullets recovered from the scene and their connection to the perpetrators. The defense faced an uphill battle. The evidence against Simon was substantial, and the nature of the crime, the murder of an entire family, including 2 young children, had shocked the community and created an atmosphere where sympathy for the defendants was virtually non-existent. On July 6, 1990, Robert Simon was sentenced for his crimes. He received life in prison for the capital murder of Charlotte Jo Parker. Additionally, he was sentenced to 30 years for kidnapping and another 30 years for sexual battery of a child. But Simon's legal troubles were far from over. He still faced trial for the murders of the other Parker family members, Carl, Bobby Joe, and Gregory. Anthony Carr also faced multiple trials for his role in the murders. The prosecution had to prove each element of each crime against each defendant, a process that required separate proceedings and substantial resources from the court system. The trials were emotionally difficult for everyone involved. Family members and friends of the Parkers had to relive the trauma of their loss through testimony and evidence. The community had to confront the reality that such a horrific crime had occurred in their peaceful corner of Mississippi. The legal proceedings in the Parker family murder case ultimately resulted in convictions for both Anthony Carr and Robert Simon. The evidence presented by the prosecution convinced juries that both men were guilty of the horrific crimes committed against the Parker family. On September 19, 1990, Anthony Carr was sentenced to death for the capital murders of Carl, Bobby Joe, Gregory, and Charlotte Jo Parker. The death sentence reflected the severity of the crimes and the aggravating factors present in the case. The murder of multiple victims, including children, the commission of murder during the course of other felonies, and the particularly heinous nature of the crimes. Robert Simon also faced additional trials for the other murders. On October 13, 1990, Simon was sentenced to death for the capital murders of Carl, Bobby Joe, and Gregory Parker, combined with his earlier sentence for Charlotte's murder. Simon faced the ultimate penalty for his role in the destruction of the Parker family. The death sentences handed down to both Carr and Simon reflected not only the severity of their crimes, but also the aggravating circumstances that surrounded the case. The victims included 2 young children who were completely innocent. The crimes involved sexual assault of a 9-year-old girl. The murders were committed in the course of other felonies, including robbery, kidnapping, and arson. Under Mississippi law, these aggravating factors justified the imposition of the death penalty. The juries who heard the evidence and deliberated on the appropriate sentences determined that the crimes were so heinous that life imprisonment was not sufficient punishment. In death penalty cases, the legal process does not end with the sentencing. Both Carr and Simon began the lengthy appeals process that is standard in capital cases, challenging their convictions and sentences through the state and federal court systems. The appeals process in death penalty cases serves several important purposes. It ensures that defendants received fair trials and competent legal representation. It allows for review of legal issues that may have affected the outcome of the trials. and it provides multiple levels of scrutiny for cases where the state seeks to impose the ultimate penalty. Robert Simon's appeal reached the Mississippi Supreme Court in 1993. His attorneys argued various issues related to his trial and conviction, but the state's highest court ultimately affirmed his conviction and death sentence. The court found that the evidence supported the jury's verdict and that Simon had received a fair trial. Similarly, Anthony Carr's case was also reviewed on appeal. His attorneys raised various legal challenges to his conviction and death sentence. But like Simon, his appeals were ultimately unsuccessful at the state level. The federal appeals process provided additional opportunities for review. But again, the courts found that both men had received fair trials and that their convictions were supported by substantial evidence. In the midst of this tragedy, there was one member of the Parker family who was not home on the night of February 2, 1990. Carl Parker had an older son from a previous relationship who was 19 years old at the time of the murders. This young man lost his father, stepmother, and two younger siblings in one horrific night of violence. He was left to deal not only with his grief, but also with the legal proceedings that followed, the media attention and the long process of seeking justice for his murdered family members. Years later, this survivor would speak publicly about the impact of the murders on his life and his ongoing quest for justice. He had to grow up quickly, dealing with unimaginable loss at a young age, while the legal system worked to hold his family's killers accountable. The survivor's story adds another dimension to this tragedy: the long-term impact on those left behind. The family members who must live with the memory of violence and loss while waiting for justice to be served. The Parker family murders sent shockwaves through rural Mississippi that extended far beyond Quitman County. In small communities where violent crime is rare, a quadruple homicide involving two young children represents a fundamental challenge to residents' sense of safety and security. The nature of the crime, a random attack on an innocent family, was particularly disturbing to community members. This was not a case where the victims had somehow invited violence through their associations or activities. The Parkers were simply a normal family, living a quiet life when they became the targets of two criminals who invaded their home with deadly intent. The murders changed how people in the community thought about their own safety. Doors that had previously been left unlocked were secured. Children who had once played freely outside without supervision were watched more carefully. The easy trust that characterized rural community life was replaced by a new wariness and caution. Local churches held prayer services for the Parker family. Community members rallied around the surviving family member, offering support and assistance during his time of grief. The local newspaper covered the investigation and trials extensively, keeping residents informed about the progress of the case. The economic cost of the investigation and prosecution was also significant for the small county. Court records indicate that the total costs approached $250,000, a substantial sum for a rural jurisdiction with limited resources. One of the most haunting aspects of the Parker family murder case is the apparent randomness of the crime. Unlike many murder cases where the perpetrators and victims have some prior relationship or connection, Carr and Simon appear to have selected the Parker family purely by chance. The evidence suggests that the original plan was robbery. Carr and Simon intended to burglarize the Parker home when they believed it would be empty. The escalation to murder occurred when they found the family at home and decided to eliminate the witnesses to their crime. This randomness makes the crime even more disturbing from a community perspective. When murders occur between people who know each other, domestic violence situations, drug deals gone bad, or personal disputes, community members can tell themselves that such violence won't touch their own lives because they're not involved in those types of relationships or activities. But when violence is truly random, when criminals select victims simply because they happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, it challenges everyone's sense of security. The Parker family did nothing to invite the violence that befell them. They were simply living their lives in their own home when evil knocked on their door. The forensic evidence in the Parker family murder case was crucial to securing convictions against Carr and Simon. Despite the fire that consumed the Parker home, investigators were able to recover significant physical evidence that linked the defendants to the crime. Ballistics evidence was particularly important. Bullets recovered from the victims' bodies were analyzed and compared to weapons associated with the defendants. This type of evidence provides objective, scientific proof that connects specific individuals to the commission of violent crimes. The medical examiner's testimony was also crucial, particularly in establishing the sequence of events and the specific causes of death. The finding that Charlotte Parker died from smoke inhalation rather than her gunshot wounds was significant in demonstrating the full scope of the defendant's criminal conduct. DNA evidence was less sophisticated in 1990 than it is today, but investigators still collected and analyzed biological evidence from the crime scene. This evidence helped establish that sexual assault had occurred and connected the defendants to that aspect of the crime. The fire investigation was another important component of the forensic case. Investigators were able to determine that the fire was deliberately set, ruling out any possibility that the deaths were the result of a tragic accident. The pattern of the fire and the presence of accelerants provided evidence of arson in addition to the murders. The Parker family murder case provides an example of the criminal justice system working as it was designed to work in serious violent crime cases. From the initial investigation through the final appeals, each step of the process served its intended purpose. Law enforcement agencies worked together to identify and apprehend the suspects quickly. The investigation was thorough and professional, collecting the evidence needed to support prosecution of the case. The prosecution presented its case effectively, using the available evidence to prove each element of each charge against each defendant. The complexity of trying multiple defendants for multiple crimes required careful coordination and substantial resources, but the prosecution met this challenge. The defense attorneys provided vigorous representation for their clients, challenging the prosecution's evidence and arguing for lesser charges or sentences where possible. Even in cases casing horrific crimes against innocent victims, the adversarial system requires that defendants receive competent legal representation. The courts manage the complex proceedings fairly and efficiently, ensuring that all parties receive due process while moving the cases toward resolution. The judges who presided over the various proceedings maintained order and impartiality despite the emotional nature of the crimes. The appeals process provided additional layers of review, ensuring that the convictions and sentences would stand up to legal scrutiny. While this process took years to complete, it served the important purpose of confirming that justice had been properly administered. While justice was ultimately served in the Parker family murder case, it came at a significant cost to the community and the legal system. The financial cost alone approached $250,000, a substantial burden for a small rural county. But the financial cost was just one measure of what this case demanded from the community. Court personnel, law enforcement officers, attorneys, and other professionals devoted countless hours to investigating, prosecuting, and adjudicating the case. Witnesses had to relive traumatic events through their testimony. Jurors had to examine horrific evidence and make life-and-death decisions about the defendants' fates. Family members and friends of the victims had to endure years of legal proceedings while dealing with their grief and loss. The emotional and psychological costs of a case like this extend far beyond the immediate participants in the legal system. The entire community had to grapple with the reality that such violence could occur in their midst, and the surviving family member had to rebuild his life while watching the legal process slowly work toward resolution. The Parker family murder case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil and violence in our society. How do we understand crimes that seem to serve no rational purpose? What drives individuals to commit acts of such senseless brutality against innocent strangers? There are no easy answers to these questions. Anthony Carr and Robert Simon made choices that night in February 1990 that destroyed multiple lives and shattered a community's sense of security. The exact motivations behind their actions may never be fully understood, even by the perpetrators themselves. What we can say with certainty is that the Parker family, Carl, Bobby Joe, Gregory, and Charlotte, deserved better. They deserved to live their quiet lives in peace, to watch their children grow up, to grow old together. Instead, their lives were cut short by strangers who broke into their home and shattered their dreams. The surviving son deserved to have his father, stepmother, and siblings with him as he navigated the challenges of young adulthood. Instead, he was left to face the world alone, carrying the burden of unimaginable loss and the memories of violence that destroyed his family. The community of Quitman County deserved to maintain its sense of safety and trust. Instead, residents were forced to confront the reality that evil can strike anywhere, at any time, without warning or reason. Despite the tragedy and loss, the Parker family murder case ultimately demonstrates that justice can prevail, even in the face of the most heinous crimes. The investigation was thorough and professional. The prosecution was vigorous and effective. The courts provided fair proceedings and appropriate sentences. Anthony Carr and Robert Simon were held accountable for their crimes. Both men received death sentences for their roles in the murder of the Parker family. While no punishment can truly balance the scales of justice when innocent lives are lost, the legal system did what it could to respond appropriately to the magnitude of their crimes. The surviving family member saw his loved one's killers brought to justice. While this could never restore what he had lost, it at least provided the knowledge that those responsible had been held accountable for their actions. The community of Quitman County could take some measure of comfort in knowing that the perpetrators had been caught and convicted. While the sense of security that was lost could never be fully restored, the successful prosecution at least demonstrated that crimes like these would not go unpunished. As we conclude this story, it's important that we remember not just the details of the crime or the legal proceedings that followed, but the lives that were lost and the people who were affected by this tragedy. Carl Parker was more than just a victim in a criminal case. He was a working man who provided for his family, a husband who loved his wife, and a father who cared for his children. His life had value and meaning beyond the violent way it ended. Bobby Jo Parker was a wife and mother who devoted herself to her family. She was part of the fabric of her community, a person who touched other lives through her daily interactions and relationships. Her death represented not just the loss of an individual life, but the loss of all the good she might have done in the years she was denied. Gregory Parker was 12 years old when he died. He was just beginning to discover who he might become as he grew toward adulthood. We can only imagine what he might have accomplished, what kind of man he might have become, what contributions he might have made to his community and the world. All of that potential was destroyed in one night of violence. Charlotte Parker was 9 years old, a little girl who should have had decades of life ahead of her. She should have grown up, gone to school, made friends, perhaps married and had children of her own. Instead, her life was ended brutally and prematurely by strangers who had no right to make that choice for her. These were real people with real lives, real dreams, and real relationships. They were not just characters in a true crime story or statistics in a criminal case file. They were human beings whose lives had value and whose deaths represent a genuine loss to their community and the world. More than 3 decades have passed since the Parker family murders shocked rural Mississippi. The legal proceedings have long since concluded. The perpetrators remain on death row, their appeals exhausted. The media attention has faded, and the case has become a matter of historical record rather than current news. But the impact of that February night in 1990 continues to resonate. The surviving family member carries the memory of his loss with him every day. Community members who lived through the investigation and trials still remember the fear and sadness that gripped their county. The case remains a reminder that evil exists in our world, that innocent people can become victims of violence through no fault of their own, and that the security we take for granted can be shattered in an instant by the actions of those who choose to do harm. At the same time, the case also demonstrates the resilience of communities and the power of the justice system to respond to even the most heinous crimes. Despite the tragedy that befell the Parker family, their community survived and rebuilt. The legal system functioned as it was designed to function, holding the perpetrators accountable for their actions. The Parker family murders represent one of the darkest chapters in the history of Quitman County, Mississippi. 4 innocent lives were lost in a single night of violence that accomplished nothing and served no purpose beyond the momentary gratification of 2 criminals who made the choice to take what was not theirs and destroy what they could not possess. Yet even in the face of such senseless tragedy, we can find evidence of human resilience, community strength, and the persistent pursuit of justice. The investigation was thorough, the prosecution was effective, and the community rallied together in the aftermath of loss. The surviving family member found the strength to go on, to rebuild his life despite the unimaginable tragedy he had endured. The community found ways to heal while never forgetting the family they had lost. The justice system proved that even the most heinous crimes would not go unpunished. As we remember the Parker family tonight, Carl, Bobby, Joe, Gregory, and Charlotte, let us honor their memory not just by recounting the details of their deaths, but by celebrating the lives they lived and the love they shared as a family. In the end, that love and those lives matter more than the violence that ended them. In the quiet darkness of rural Mississippi, on nights when the wind blows through the trees and the stars shine down on the countryside, perhaps we can imagine the Parker family as they should be remembered. Not as victims of a horrible crime, but as a family who loved each other and who deserved the peaceful life they were trying to build together. Their story reminds us to cherish our own families, to appreciate the security we often take for granted, and to remember that justice, though sometimes slow in coming, can ultimately prevail even in the face of the greatest evil. Rest in peace, Carl, Bobby Joe, Gregory, and Charlotte Parker. Your lives mattered, your loss is remembered, and your story will not be forgotten. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. The quiet suburb of Atascocita, Texas, nestled just outside Houston, was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names and children played safely in tree-lined streets. It was November 1994, and the autumn air carried the promise of approaching holidays. For most families in the area, it was a time of preparation and anticipation, but for 33-year-old Farah Frada, that November evening would become her last. Farah was a devoted mother to 3 young children, ages 7, 6, and 4. Those who knew her described her as gentle, caring, and completely dedicated to her family. She had the kind of warm smile that could light up a room, and her children were the absolute center of her world. But behind the facade of suburban normalcy, Farah was navigating one of the most challenging periods of her life. Her marriage to Robert Frada, known to friends as Bob, had been deteriorating for months. Bob worked as a public safety officer for the city of Missouri City, a job that should have represented protection and service to the community. He was the kind of man who appeared confident, even cocky to those who met him. At the local gym where he worked out religiously, Bob was known for his muscular build and his tendency to dominate conversations. But beneath that confident exterior lay a man whose marriage was crumbling and whose response to that dissolution would prove to be nothing short of monstrous. The couple had been locked in an increasingly bitter divorce proceeding. What had started as the natural dissolution of an incompatible marriage had evolved into something much darker. Court testimony would later reveal that Bob's intensifying sexual appetites had been a significant factor in pushing Farah toward divorce. She had reached a point where she could no longer tolerate the direction their relationship had taken. As autumn progressed, the custody battle over their 3 children became particularly contentious. Farah was fighting not just for her own future, but for the well-being of her children. She understood, perhaps more clearly than the courts at the time, that Bob's obsession with control extended far beyond their failed marriage. Bob, for his part, was consumed with rage over the pending divorce. Court records would later show that he had approached numerous people with an unthinkable question. Did they know anyone who would kill Farah? To his gym buddies, to casual acquaintances, to anyone who would listen, Bob spoke openly about his desire to get rid of his wife. More than a dozen people who worked out at the same gym later told investigators that Bob talked a lot about eliminating Farah from his life. What made Bob's behavior particularly chilling was how brazenly he discussed his homicidal fantasies. This wasn't a man consumed by passion in the heat of the moment. This was calculated, persistent, and methodical. He was shopping for a killer with the same casual approach one might use to find a contractor for home renovations. Eventually, Bob's persistent inquiries reached the wrong, or from his twisted perspective, the right person. Through his network of gym acquaintances and casual contacts, Bob connected with Joseph Pristash, a man who would serve as the crucial middleman in what would become a cold-blooded murder-for-hire plot. Pristash, in turn, knew exactly the person Bob was looking for: Howard Goodry, a teenager with a criminal background and a willingness to kill for money. The price was set at $1,000 in a Jeep, a pathetically small sum for a human life, but apparently sufficient to purchase the services of a young man desperate enough to commit murder. The plan was methodical and deliberate. Bob would establish an alibi that he believed would be unshakable. On the night of the murder, he would take his 3 children to church, ensuring that he would be surrounded by witnesses who could testify to his whereabouts. It was a particularly cynical touch, using his own children in a house of worship as props in his elaborate deception. November 9, 1994, began like any other day for Farah. She went about her normal routine, perhaps not fully aware that her estranged husband's months of violent fantasizing were about to become reality. As evening approached, she returned home to her house on Forest Fern Drive in Atascocita, the same house where she was raising her 3 children as a single mother. The garage where Farah parked her car was attached to the house, a common feature in suburban Texas homes. It provided convenience and shelter from the elements. But on this night, it would become a trap. As Farah stepped out of her vehicle, she likely felt safe in her own home, in her own neighborhood, surrounded by familiar sights and sounds. But waiting in the shadows was Howard Gadry, armed with a .38 Smith & Wesson revolver. The weapon, investigators would later discover, was registered to none other than Bob Fratta himself. A crucial piece of evidence that would eventually unravel his carefully constructed alibi. The attack was swift and brutal. Gadry shot Farah twice in the head as she stood in her garage. The shots echoed through the quiet neighborhood, a sound that would haunt those who heard it for years to come. Farah collapsed immediately, her life ending in the place where she had felt most secure. Joseph Pristash served as the getaway driver, waiting nearby to help Gadry escape once the deed was done. The two men fled into the night, leaving behind a crime scene that would devastate a family and shock a community. Meanwhile, across town, Bob Fratta sat in church with his 3 children, ages 7, 6, and 4. To anyone observing him that evening, he appeared to be exactly what he pretended to be, a devoted father spending quality time with his kids. The children, innocent of their father's true nature, participated in the service while their mother lay dying miles away. When the call came in about the shooting, Bob's reaction was telling, rather than the devastated grief one might expect from a husband who had just lost his wife. Bob displayed a cold composure that struck investigators as unusual. In fact, KHEO U11 cameras were rolling when Bob arrived for questioning, and what they captured was remarkable. A man who seemed almost cocky, cheesing to the camera, as one detective later described it. "He's just happy-go-lucky," Harris County Sheriff's Office Detective Larry Davis observed. "He's cheesing to the camera." This was not the demeanor of a grieving widower. This was the behavior of a man who believed he had successfully executed the perfect crime. The investigation that followed would take months to fully develop, but it would ultimately expose the web of connections that led back to Bob Fratta. The first major break came in March 1995, when Howard Gadry was arrested for an unrelated bank robbery. During that arrest, police discovered the .38 Smith & Wesson revolver that had been used to kill Farah. When investigators traced the serial number, they made a shocking discovery. The weapon was registered to Bob Fratta. This revelation transformed what had been a challenging investigation into a clear path toward the truth. But there was another crucial witness who would help unravel the conspiracy. Joseph Pristash had been living with his girlfriend, Mary Gipp, at the time of the murder. On the night of the shooting, Gipp was home when Pristash returned from his role as getaway driver. Something about his behavior that night troubled her, and in a decision that would prove crucial to the investigation, she secretly wrote down the serial number of the .38 Smith & Wesson revolver. When that same weapon was later linked to Gadry's bank robbery arrest, the connection became clear. Mary Gipp's foresight in recording the serial number provided the missing link that tied all 3 men to Farah's murder. Faced with overwhelming evidence, both Pristash and Gadry eventually confessed to their roles in the crime. Pristash admitted to serving as the getaway driver, while Gadry acknowledged that he had been the one to pull the trigger. Most importantly, both men implicated Bob Fratta as the mastermind who had orchestrated the entire plot. Under Texas law, the distinction between mastermind, middleman, and triggerman is irrelevant in murder-for-hire cases. All 3 men were equally culpable for Farah's death, and all 3 would face the ultimate punishment. The impact on Farah's children was devastating and long-lasting. In December 1994, just weeks after their mother's murder, the courts decided that the 3 children should be placed in the custody of their maternal grandparents, Lex and Betty Baker. Bob was granted only supervised visitation rights for every Saturday, along with daily 15-minute phone calls with his children. The children who had lost their mother to violence and their father to his own evil choices would grow up in the shadow of this tragedy. During Bob's eventual retrial years later, they would face the additional trauma of witnessing the legal proceedings against their father, seeing firsthand the evidence of his guilt in orchestrating their mother's murder. One particularly heart-wrenching moment came during the trial when Farah's 7-year-old son took the witness stand. Prosecutor Kelly Siegler, who handled the case, later described it as a moment she would never forget. A young boy forced to testify in his mother's murder case, a burden no child should ever have to bear. The legal proceedings against Bob Fratta would span decades, marked by appeals, retrials, and constant delays that prevented justice from being served swiftly. His first conviction was overturned on technical grounds related to the statements made by his co-conspirators. But the evidence against him was overwhelming, and he was ultimately convicted again. Throughout the lengthy legal process, Bob maintained his innocence, but the evidence painted an unmistakable picture of a man whose narcissistic rage had led him to commit the ultimate act of domestic violence. The testimonies from his gym acquaintances, the physical evidence of his own gun being used in the murder, and the confessions of his co-conspirators all pointed to the same conclusion. Bob Fratta had orchestrated his wife's murder with cold-blooded calculation. On May 14, 2009, nearly 15 years after Farah's murder, a jury found Bob Fratta guilty of solicitation of capital murder. 2 weeks later, on May 29, 2009, that same jury sentenced him to death. His defense team had urged the jury to consider life imprisonment, pointing to his model behavior during his 15 years of incarceration, but the jury was unmoved by these pleas. The case would continue to wind through the appeals process for more than a decade. Bob's accomplices, Joseph Pristash and Howard Guidry, were also sentenced to death for their roles in the murder. The three men would spend years on death row, their fates intertwined by the crime they had committed together. In a twist of fate, Joseph Pristash, the middleman who had connected Bob with his teenage hitman, died on death row before his execution could be carried out. This left Bob and Howard Guidry as the surviving members of the conspiracy, both awaiting their dates with the executioner. Throughout his time on death row, Bob continued to maintain his innocence, but those who had investigated the case and prosecuted it remained convinced of his guilt. The evidence was simply too overwhelming, the pattern of behavior too clear, and the testimonies too consistent to support any other conclusion. As Bob's execution date approached, there were the usual last-minute legal challenges. On January 10, 2023, just hours before his scheduled execution, U.S. District Judge Catherine Mousy issued a temporary injunction based on concerns about expired lethal injection drugs. However, higher courts quickly rejected these challenges, and the execution was allowed to proceed. On that January evening in 2023, nearly 3 decades after Farah Fratta was murdered in her garage, Robert Fratta was led into the execution chamber at the state penitentiary in Huntsville, Texas. At 65 years old, he had spent more than half his adult life on death row, but he had never shown genuine remorse for his crime. Present for the execution were members of both families affected by this tragedy. Bob's oldest son was there, now a grown man who had lived his entire adult life with the knowledge that his father had murdered his mother. Farah's brother was also present, representing a family that had waited decades for justice to finally be served. When offered the opportunity to make a final statement, Bob Fratta declined. He had no words of apology for his children, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused, no expression of remorse for the life he had taken. As one prosecutor noted after his death, Bob was a coward in 1994 when he arranged the murder for hire of his estranged wife, and he remained a coward to the end. At 7:49 p.m. on January 10, 2023, Robert Fratta was pronounced dead by lethal injection. His execution marked the first carried out by the state of Texas in 2023, and it brought to a close one of Houston's most notorious murder cases. But while justice was finally served for Bob Fratta, the story doesn't end with his death. The 3 children who lost their mother that November night in 1994 had grown up and built lives of their own, carrying with them the complex trauma of having lost one parent to violence and the other to his own evil choices. Howard Guidry, the teenage hitman who had actually pulled the trigger, remained on death row, still awaiting his own execution. Joseph Pristash's death in prison meant that he would never face the executioner, but the memory of his role in this crime would live on in the case records and in the hearts of those who knew Farah. The murder of Farah Fratta serves as a stark reminder of how domestic violence can escalate to the ultimate tragedy. What began as a contentious divorce had evolved into a murder-for-hire plot that destroyed multiple lives and traumatized an entire community. It shows us how a man's inability to accept the end of his marriage, combined with his obsession with control, can lead to unthinkable acts of violence. For the investigators who worked the case, for the prosecutors who sought justice, and for the family members who survived this tragedy, Farah's story represents both the worst of human nature and the importance of never giving up in the pursuit of truth. Detective Larry Davis, who had observed Bob's cocky demeanor during the initial investigation, lived to see justice finally served nearly 3 decades later. Prosecutor Kelly Siegler, who had worked tirelessly to secure convictions against all 3 men involved in the conspiracy, could finally know that the legal system had held them accountable for their crimes. The image of that 7-year-old boy testifying at his father's trial would always stay with her, But she could also take satisfaction in knowing that his mother's killer had finally paid the ultimate price. In the quiet suburb of Atascocita, where Farah had lived and died, life had moved on. New families had moved into the neighborhood. Children had grown up and moved away, and the house on Forest Fern Drive had passed to new owners. But for those who remembered that November night in 1994, the memory of Farah Fratta lived on, not as a victim, but as a mother who had fought for her children until the very end. The case also serves as a reminder of how evil can hide behind a badge and a uniform. Bob Fratta's position as a public safety officer should have represented protection and service, but he perverted that trust in the most horrific way possible. He used his position and his connections to orchestrate a murder, betraying not only his family but the community he had sworn to serve. Perhaps most tragically, Bob's crime robbed 3 children of their childhood innocence and their sense of safety in the world. They had to grow up knowing that the man who should have protected them above all others had instead chosen to destroy their family. The psychological impact of such a betrayal is impossible to fully measure, but it undoubtedly shaped their lives in ways that continue to this day. As we reflect on this case, we're reminded that justice, while sometimes delayed, can ultimately prevail. The investigators who refused to give up, the prosecutors who pursued the case through multiple trials and appeals, and the witnesses who came forward with crucial evidence all played a part in ensuring that Bob Fratta was held accountable for his actions. The story of Farah Fratta's murder is ultimately a story about the destruction that one person's evil choices can wreak on countless lives. But it's also a story about resilience, about the strength of those who survive such tragedies, and about the importance of never stopping in the pursuit of truth and justice. In the end, Bob Fratta's carefully constructed alibi failed him. His belief that he could orchestrate the perfect crime proved to be nothing more than narcissistic delusion. The truth, as it always does, eventually emerged from the shadows, and justice, though delayed, was finally served. For Farah Fratta, a devoted mother who died protecting the life she had built for her children, that justice came nearly 30 years too late. But for her family, for the investigators who worked her case, and for the community that had been shaken by her murder, Bob Fratta's execution represented the final chapter in a long and painful journey toward closure. The garage where Farah took her last breath may have been the scene of a horrific crime, but her memory lives on in the children she raised, in the lives she touched, and in the justice that was ultimately served in her name. In the quiet suburbs of Texas, where neighbors know each other's names and children play in tree-lined streets, her story serves as both a warning about the evil that can lurk behind familiar faces and a testament to the enduring power of love, truth, and justice. And so, as we close this chapter on one of Texas's most notorious murder cases, we remember not the man who orchestrated this crime, but the woman whose life was taken far too soon, and the children who survived to carry on her memory, in their strength, in their resilience, and in their ability to build meaningful lives despite the tragedy that shaped their childhood. We find hope that even in the darkest of stories, light can ultimately prevail. The execution of Robert Fratta brought an end to a case that had haunted Houston for 3 decades. But the lessons of Farah's story continue to resonate. In a world where domestic violence remains all too common, her case reminds us of the importance of recognizing the warning signs, of taking threats seriously, and of never underestimating the potential for evil that can exist within seemingly ordinary relationships. For those who worked to bring Bob Fratta to justice, for the family members who survived this tragedy, and for the community that was forever changed by Farah's murder, her story will always serve as a reminder that, while evil may triumph temporarily, truth and justice have a way of prevailing in the end. And in that knowledge, perhaps, there is some measure of peace to be found. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. In the quiet town of Simpsonville, South Carolina, where rolling hills meet suburban neighborhoods, a young woman named Catherine Cathy Blauvelt was building what she hoped would be a peaceful new chapter of her life. It was October 2016, and at just 22 years old, Cathy had already served her country in the United States Army and was working at a local PetSmart, surrounded by the animals she loved. She had recently separated from her husband, John Blauvelt, also an Army soldier, and was looking forward to independence and a fresh start. Cathy was the kind of person who lit up a room. Her friends described her as vibrant, caring, and fiercely loyal. She had a way with animals that seemed almost magical, and her co-workers at PetSmart often marveled at how even the most anxious pets would calm in her presence. She was petite, with dark hair and expressive eyes that seemed to hold endless compassion. Those who knew her said she had an infectious laugh and an unwavering belief that tomorrow would be better than today. But in the autumn of 2016, Caddy's tomorrow would never come. The story begins not with the crime itself, but with the slow dissolution of a marriage that had once held promise. John Tufton Blauvelt, 33 years old, had built his identity around being a United States Army recruiter. It was more than a job to him, it was who he was. He took pride in his uniform, in his ability to inspire young people to serve their country, and in the respect that came with his position. John was methodical, disciplined, and by all accounts good at what he did. But marriages are delicate ecosystems, and the Blauvelt marriage had been suffering from a series of small fractures that were beginning to spread into something much larger. The couple had been growing apart for months, their communication deteriorating into arguments and long silences. Caddy had begun to feel trapped, controlled, and increasingly fearful of the man she had once loved. The first major crack in John's carefully constructed world came in the form of a revelation that would ultimately cost him everything he held dear. In his role as an Army recruiter, John had been engaging in an inappropriate relationship with a 17-year-old girl named Hannah Thompson. This wasn't just a violation of military regulations. It was a betrayal of the trust placed in him by the community and the Army. When this relationship came to light, the consequences were swift and severe. The Department of the Army acted decisively. John was removed from his recruiting duties, the work that defined him, the role in which he took such pride. His pay was cut, and he faced disciplinary action that would permanently alter the trajectory of his military career. For a man who had built his entire sense of self around being a soldier and a recruiter, this was devastating. But rather than accepting responsibility for his actions, John found someone to blame: his wife, Caddy. In John's mind, Caddy was responsible for his downfall. He told friends and family that she had reported him, that she had destroyed his career out of spite. The truth was more complex, as truth often is. But John had decided on his narrative, and in that narrative, Caddy was the villain who needed to be punished. My friends would later recall conversations with John where he spoke openly about wanting revenge against Caddy. These weren't vague threats or angry words spoken in the heat of the moment. According to investigators, John expressed a clear intent to make Caddy pay for what he perceived as her role in destroying his life. The woman he had once promised to love and protect had become, in his mind, an enemy who deserved his hatred. As the autumn days grew shorter in South Carolina, Caddy was trying to move forward with her life. She had filed for separation and was in the process of officially ending her marriage to John. She was working her shifts at PetSmart, spending time with friends, and slowly beginning to heal from the trauma of a relationship that had become toxic and frightening. She had reported to authorities that John had pulled a gun on her just a month earlier, leading to domestic violence charges against him. This incident had shown her just how dangerous her estranged husband had become. October 23, 2016 began like any other day for Caddy. She went to work at the PetSmart in Greenville, caring for animals and helping customers, bringing her characteristic warmth and dedication to everything she did. Her shift ended at 2:15 in the afternoon, and she left work as usual, planning to meet friends later that day. It was a simple plan, the kind of everyday arrangement that millions of people make without a second thought. But Caddy never made it to meet her friends. When she failed to show up, her friends initially weren't alarmed. People run late. Plans change. Life happens. But as the hours passed and Caddy didn't answer her phone, concern began to grow. This wasn't like her. Caddy was reliable, considerate, the type of person who would call if she was going to be late. As evening turned to night and still no word came from Caddy, her friends contacted her family. By the morning of October 24th, Key Blauvelt had been officially reported missing. Her family and friends began a frantic search, calling hospitals, checking with mutual acquaintances, driving the routes she might have taken. The police were notified, and what would become a massive investigation began to take shape. Less than 24 hours after Caddy was reported missing, the search came to a heartbreaking end. In an abandoned farmhouse in Simpsonville, South Carolina, investigators made a discovery that would haunt everyone involved in the case. Caddy Blauvelt had been found, but she was no longer alive. The scene was one of brutal violence. Caddy had been stabbed in the neck with such force that the blade of the knife had broken off inside her body. An X-ray would later show the metal fragment lodged in her neck, a chilling piece of evidence that spoke to the savage nature of the attack. This was not a crime of passion that had gotten out of hand. This was a deliberate, vicious assault designed to end a young woman's life. The abandoned farmhouse where Caddy's body was discovered added another layer of horror to an already terrible crime. This wasn't a random location. It was isolated, hidden, the kind of place someone would choose if they wanted to ensure their victim's screams wouldn't be heard. The killer had planned this, had thought about where to take Caddy, had considered how to commit this act without being interrupted. Almost immediately, investigators had a prime suspect, John Blauvelt. Everything about the crime pointed to him. He had motive, the blame and resentment he harbored toward Caddy for his military troubles. He had opportunity. Caddy was vulnerable during the transition time between leaving work and meeting her friends. And he had means, access to weapons, and the physical capability to overpower his petite estranged wife. But when police went to arrest John Blauvelt, they discovered he was gone, not just absent from his home, but completely vanished. Along with his 17-year-old girlfriend, Hannah Thompson. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Caddy's body was discovered on October 24th, and John and Hannah had disappeared without a trace around the same time. This disappearance transformed the investigation from a murder case into a massive manhunt. John Blauvelt was now not just a murder suspect. He was a deserter from the United States Army, having gone AWOL at the exact time when he should have been answering questions about his wife's death. The U.S. Marshals Service became involved, bringing federal resources to bear on what was now a multi-agency investigation spanning multiple states. The concern for Hannah Thompson's safety added urgency to the manhunt. Here was a 17-year-old girl on the run with a man suspected of brutal murder. Was she a willing accomplice, or was she another potential victim? Law enforcement agencies across the country were alerted to be on the lookout for John Blauvelt and Hannah Thompson, two people who seemed to have vanished into thin air. For weeks, then months, there were no solid leads. John Blauvelt had been a recruiter, trained in planning and logistics. He knew how to organize operations, how to think several steps ahead, and how to adapt to changing circumstances. These skills, which had made him effective in the military, were now being used to evade capture. The investigation continued, but John and Hannah seemed to have disappeared completely. Meanwhile, Caddy's family was left to grieve and to wait for justice. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched in her 22 years. Military honors were rendered for the young soldier who would never again serve her country. Friends and family shared memories of her kindness, her love of animals, her dreams for the future that would never be realized. But underneath the grief was anger. And underneath the anger was a desperate need for answers and accountability. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. In December 2016, about 2 months after Caddy's murder, Hannah Thompson was found safe and was reunited with her family. The details of how she was located and what had happened during those months on the run were closely guarded by investigators. But her recovery provided the first real lead in the search for John Blauvelt. Through information provided by Hannah Thompson, investigators learned that she and John had been living as homeless individuals in Oregon, far from South Carolina and the scene of the crime. This revelation narrowed the search area considerably and gave law enforcement agencies specific regions to focus their efforts. But even with this information, John Blauvelt proved elusive. The manhunt for John Blauvelt would stretch on for years. He had essentially become a ghost, living off the grid, avoiding any official contact that might reveal his location. The case was featured on television shows, including In Pursuit with John Walsh, bringing national attention to the search. Tips came in from across the country, but each lead seemed to end in disappointment. For Caddy's family, these years of waiting were excruciating. Every phone call from the police brought hope that there might be news, and every day that passed without an arrest meant another day that John Blauvelt was free, while their daughter, sister, and friend was gone forever. The not knowing was almost as painful as the loss itself. Law enforcement never gave up. U.S. Marshals continued to follow leads, no matter how cold they might seem. They tracked down associates, investigated sightings, and slowly built a picture of where John Blauvelt might be hiding. The investigation consumed thousands of hours and involved dozens of agencies, all working toward the same goal, bringing John Blauvelt to justice. The persistence paid off on July 20th, 2022, almost 6 years after Katie Blauvelt's murder. Acting on intelligence gathered over years of investigation, U.S. Marshals and other law enforcement agencies surrounded a house in Medford, Oregon. Inside, they found the man they had been searching for, John Tufton Blauvelt. The arrest was anticlimactic compared to the years of searching that preceded it. John didn't resist. He was taken into custody without incident, and began the process of being extradited back to South Carolina to face charges for his wife's murder. After 6 years on the run, 6 years of freedom while Kathy lay in her grave, John Blauvelt would finally face a jury. The extradition process moved smoothly, and soon John was back in South Carolina, sitting in a jail cell and facing the reality that his years of running were over. The charges against him were severe: murder in the first degree and possession of a weapon during a violent crime. If convicted, he would face life in prison without the possibility of parole. The trial of John Blauvelt began in September 2024, more than 7 years after Kathy's death. The courtroom was filled with Kathy's family and friends, people who had waited nearly a decade for this moment. The prosecution, led by prosecutor Ken Liabi, methodically built their case against John, using the physical evidence, witness testimony, and John's own actions in the aftermath of the murder to paint a picture of premeditated homicide. The broken knife blade found in Kathy's neck became a central piece of evidence. Forensic experts testified about the force required to break a blade in such a manner, the precision of the wound, and the deliberate nature of the attack. This wasn't a struggle that had gotten out of hand. This was an execution. Hannah Thompson, now an adult, took the witness stand to testify about her relationship with John and the events surrounding Kathy's murder. Her testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case, providing insight into John's state of mind and his actions in the days and weeks following the crime. She described a man consumed with hatred for his estranged wife, someone who had expressed clear intentions of revenge. The defense attempted to create reasonable doubt, suggesting that the evidence was circumstantial and that John's flight from South Carolina didn't necessarily prove his guilt. They argued that a person might run for many reasons and that the prosecution hadn't definitively proven that John was the killer, but the evidence was overwhelming. Text messages between John and various associates showed his growing resentment toward Kathy and his stated desire for revenge. Witness testimony confirmed that John had openly discussed his hatred for his wife and his belief that she was responsible for his military troubles. The timing of his disappearance, coinciding almost exactly with the discovery of Kathy's body, suggested consciousness of guilt. Perhaps most damning was the physical evidence. The knife blade in Kathy's neck could be traced to a type of weapon that John had access to. The location where Kathy's body was found was isolated, and would have required local knowledge to locate. Everything pointed to one conclusion: John Blauvelt had lured his estranged wife to that abandoned farmhouse and murdered her in cold blood. The trial lasted several days, with both sides presenting their arguments and evidence to a jury of 12 South Carolina residents. For Kathy's family, sitting through the details of her murder was agonizing, but necessary. They needed to hear the truth, to understand exactly what had happened to their loved one, and to see justice finally served. On September 20th, 2024, after deliberating for several hours, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on all charges. John Tufton Blauvelt was convicted of murdering his wife Catherine Kathy Blauvelt and of possessing a weapon during a violent crime. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. The conviction brought a measure of closure to Kathy's family, but it couldn't bring her back. During the sentencing hearing, family members spoke about the devastating impact of Kathy's death and the years of uncertainty they had endured while John was on the run. They talked about the young woman she had been, the dreams she had held, and the future that had been stolen from her. John Blauvelt showed little emotion throughout the trial. In sentencing, the man who had once taken pride in his military service, who had seen himself as someone who inspired others to serve their country, was now facing the rest of his life behind bars. He has since filed an appeal of his conviction, maintaining his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence against him. Hannah Thompson, who had been just 17 when she was swept up in John's web of violence and deception, also faced charges related to the case. She was charged with 5 felony counts, including obstruction of justice and being an accessory after the fact to murder. Authorities made clear that they did not believe Hannah was present when John murdered Kathy, but her actions in helping him evade capture for 6 years carried their own legal consequences. She has pleaded not guilty to all charges. The case of Kathy Blauvelt raises uncomfortable questions about domestic violence, military culture, and the warning signs that too often go unheeded. Kathy had reported to authorities that John had threatened her with a gun just a month before her death. She was in the process of leaving him. taking the steps that experts recommend for someone in an abusive relationship. But sometimes, even when someone does everything right, tragedy still strikes. John's sense of entitlement, his inability to accept responsibility for his own actions, and his willingness to blame others for his failures created a perfect storm of resentment and rage. When his military career crumbled due to his inappropriate relationship with a teenager, he should have looked inward and accepted the consequences of his choices. Instead, he chose to see himself as a victim and Katie as the cause of his problems. The murder of Katie Blauvelt was not a crime of passion or a moment of poor judgment. It was a calculated act of revenge by a man who had decided that destroying his wife's life was preferable to rebuilding his own. The isolated location, the savage nature of the attack, and the immediate flight from the area all point to premeditation and careful planning. For 6 years, John Blauvelt lived as a free man, while Katie's family grieved and wondered if justice would ever be served. He experienced sunrises and sunsets, changing seasons, perhaps even moments of happiness, while his victim lay cold in the ground. The fact that he was able to evade capture for so long speaks to both his cunning and the challenges faced by law enforcement in tracking down someone determined to disappear. The persistence of the investigators who never gave up on the case is remarkable. U.S. Marshals, local police, and federal agents worked for years, following every lead, no matter how slim, until finally bringing John Blauvelt to justice. Their dedication ensured that Katie's murder would not become another cold case, another unsolved tragedy. Today, John Blauvelt sits in a South Carolina prison, where he will spend the rest of his natural life. At 33 when he committed the murder, he may have decades ahead of him to contemplate what he did and what he lost. His military service, once a source of pride, is now forever tainted by his crimes. His freedom is gone, his reputation destroyed, his legacy one of violence and betrayal. Katie Blauvelt, who should have had decades of life ahead of her, remains frozen in time at 22 years old. She will never know the joy of a career she loved, the contentment of a healthy relationship, the satisfaction of growing old surrounded by people who cared about her. Her life was cut short by the very person who had once promised to love and protect her. The case serves as a reminder that domestic violence can escalate quickly and unpredictably. The fact that John was a military recruiter, someone trusted by the community and by young people considering military service, shows that abuse can come from unexpected sources. Position, reputation, and public standing are no guarantee of private character. For those who knew and loved Katie, her memory lives on in the kindness she showed to others, the animals she cared for, and the joy she brought to those around her. She is remembered not as a victim, but as a person who made the world a little brighter during her too brief time here. The legal proceedings may continue as appeals are filed and other charges are resolved, but the central question of what happened to Katie Blauvelt has been answered. Justice, delayed but not denied, has finally been served. A young woman's life was taken in an act of calculated revenge, but her killer will never again know freedom. In the quiet town of Simpsonville, South Carolina, where the story began, people remember Katie Blauvelt as she was in life, vibrant, caring, and full of hope for the future. Her murder shocked the community and changed many lives forever, but it also demonstrated the power of persistence, the importance of never giving up on justice, and the enduring strength of those who loved her. The case is closed, the verdicts rendered, the sentences imposed, but the impact of what happened in October 2016 continues to ripple outward, touching everyone who knew Katie, everyone who worked to find her killer, and everyone who believes that justice, however long delayed, must eventually prevail. And so ends the story of Katie Blauvelt, a young woman whose life was stolen but whose memory endures, and of John Blauvelt, a man who traded everything good in his life for a moment of terrible revenge that will cost him his freedom forever. The quiet nights in Simpsonville continue, as they always have, as they always will, but now finally there is peace in knowing that justice has been served, and that Katie Blauvelt can rest knowing her killer will never harm anyone else again. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.